Good morning, everyone.
Ma'am, shall we start now?
Yeah, is it 6? I mean, is it 7? Sorry. Is it 7?
Yeah.
Yes. Then please start.
Good evening, dear all. On behalf of the International School for Sri Shankaracharya Studies, I welcome you to the International Lecture Series on Teacher, Text and Traditions in Philosophical Heritage. Today, we are truly privileged to have with us Professor William Sweet, Professor of Biomedical Ethics and Philosophy of Law, Jules Ledger Research Chair in the Humanities and Social Sciences, and the former Professor, Department of Philosophy, St. Francis Xavier University, Canada. And let us begin the program with an invocation by Professor Preeti Satish, Department of Music, SSUS, Kaladi. Ma'am, over to you.
मैत्रीं भजत अखिलहृद्येत्री मैत्रीं भजत अखिलहृद्येत्री आत्मवदेव परानपि पश्यत आत्मवदेव परानपि पश्यत युद्धं त्यजत स्पर्धां त्यजत युद्धं त्यजत स्पर्धां त्यजत त्यजत परेष्वक्रममाक्रमणम् जननी पृथ्वी कामदुःखास्ते जननी पृथ्वी कामदुःखास्ते जनको देवः सकलदयालो दाम्यत दत्त दयध्वं जनता दाम्यत दत्त दयध्वं जनता श्रेयो भूयात् सकलजनानां श्रेयो भूयात् सकलजनानां मैत्रीं भजत अखिलहृद्ये
Thank you so much, dear ma'am, for your beautiful company. And I invite Professor Srikalam Nair, Director, International School for Sri Shankaracharya Studies, and the Head, Department of Philosophy, SSUS, Kaladi, introduce the speaker and the theme.
Kalyana Gunagatraya Kamidu Bhaladayini Srimad Venkatanadaya Srinivasaya Te Namaha. Friends, good evening to all, and good morning to Professor Sweet, I suppose. I'm indeed glad to introduce Professor William Sweet to this august community of scholars. Professor Sweet, who is currently Professor of Biomedical Ethics and Philosophy, holds Jules Legal Research Chair in Humanities and Social Sciences in St. Francis Xavier University, one of the leading universities in Canada, where I had the fortune to visit and stay there for a month as part of the Shastri Inter-Canadian Research Program. He is a renowned scholar in cultural studies, particularly intercultural philosophy, and formerly he was director of the Center for Philosophy, Theology and Cultural Traditions of the same university, that is St. Francis Xavier University. And he has also been a member of the Faculty of Graduate and Postdoctoral Studies of the University of Ottawa and serves as an adjunct professor in the graduate program of St. Paul University and the Collège Dominicain de Philosophie in Ottawa, Canada. And Sweet was a professor of philosophy and Professor of Religious Studies at St. Thomas University in Fredericton, New Brunswick, where he also served as Vice President for an year, that is from 2007 to 2008. He has been into a lot of administrative, academic administration, as I am aware, and his contributions to not only academic philosophy but to academic administration is also immense and valuable. He has also been a visiting professor of John Paul II Catholic University of Lublin, Poland. And he has also been visiting professor of Dharmaram Vidyakshetram and also the University of Pune in India some time back. And friends, I must tell you that, of course, I have introduced him as an expert in cultural studies, particularly intercultural philosophies. His specializations include political philosophy, with an emphasis on contemporary concerns on human rights. And I have known him as a philosophy of religion with a focus on epistemology of philosophy, the epistemological underpinnings in philosophy of religion. And yet another area of interest for him was British idealism. And probably that is one of the reasons why he was brought close to India. As I see, probably three things would have brought him repeatedly to India. To my knowledge, he has visited at least 13 times in India. And the three things, as I understand, is first the intimate relation between culture and philosophy in this land. Uh, Through the conversation that we have had for more than now 6-7 years, or even more than that, I've learned that he has been immensely impressed with the intimate relation that philosophy holds with the culture of the land, probably something which is unique for the whole of the globe. And the second is his interest in idealism, and he is an expert in British idealism. And you know that you have beautiful versions of idealism available in India, particularly coming from Advaita Vedanta and Madhyamaka Buddhism, why the whole of Vedanta offer different versions of idealism. And the third thing, which is a recent interest in him, as human rights and the Buddha's insights on human rights. I think he is coming up with a volume on that. And he was also our ICPR's visiting professor some time back, I think some 5 years back also, and newly been nominated to IIP, a pretty prestigious body internationally, where scholars like Amartya Sen, D.P. Chattopadhyay and others from India are members. Above all these academic gains, and I should not forget to introduce some of the major publications. The publications are huge, but I'll just introduce some of the recent publications of Professor Sweets. They are Care of Self and Meaning of Life, published in 2015. What is intercultural philosophy, again in 2015, Cultural Clash and Religion in 2014, Ideas and Fire, Philosophy Emerging from Culture, Migrating Text and Tradition, a volume which is gifted to me. I have had a reading of at least portions of it. It's a beautiful work. Responses to the Enlightenment. These are some of the works that, the recent work, of course, his contributions are huge. Above all these academic contributions that he has made, my interest in this professor is his established a friendship with India. He always sees to it that Indians have a face in, or have a space in the global philosophical forums. When we have the global meetings, he sees to it that the Indian representations get a good hearing. We are indeed grateful to you, Professor Sweet, for this. And almost all leading professors in India hold him high He is a friend of almost all the leading philosophers like Professor Bhatt. The list is too huge, and therefore I do not want to list out them here. I have known him since 2012 when I have been visited, I have invited him to the Department of Philosophy in my university. And after that, I think he has made one or two visits more to Kaladi, and several times to India. He visits very often Pune, Chennai, and Delhi, and also to Calcutta. We are extremely glad that Professor Sweet is with us on behalf of International School of Sri Shankaracharya Studies. I extend a very warm welcome to Professor Sweet to this August gathering, and we really look forward to listen from you how Radhakrishnan has brought Indian philosophy to the Western platforms. I do not want to speak much on Radhakrishnan because he's going to speak on this. And all that I would like to speak about Dr. Radhakrishnan, in fact, I was fortunate to study in the Department of Philosophy in University of Madras, which was then titled as Radhakrishnan Center for Advanced Study in Philosophy in University of Madras. Currently, it is no more named so. It is no more a Center of Advanced Study for that matter. But we all know Dr. Radhakrishnan is one who has taken Indian philosophy to the Western platforms and was able to put across the philosophies, it should be in plural, as you all know, in a meaningful way, in a rational way, in an objective fashion to the Western community. Why? Particularly to the Western community and to the whole world at large. And his volumes in Indian philosophy is read even today by the student community. There were several other scholarly publications, particularly that of Das Gupta, and are more scholarly, definitely. But Radhakrishnan's volumes have this benefit that it is argumentative, and it addresses someone who is not already been familiarized with Indian philosophy. So you can start from a 0 point, and then you can pick up the stuff. Of course, he is being criticized for taking philosophy outside the tradition, which the other schools, the other interpreters like Das Gupta, Hirian, and all, while they all have succeeded in presenting the history of Indian philosophy, retaining it within the tradition, he has somehow tried to rationalize it, borrowed the virtues of enlightenment, rationality, and tried to objectivize it, so on and so forth. This is one criticism that has been raised against Dr. Radhakrishnan. But the huge contribution that he has, it's very easy to stand back and then criticize someone, but the huge contribution that he has made. Today you are able to meaningfully converse about Indian philosophy to leading professors across the globe because of Radhakrishnan and his contributions. That factor we should not forget. And there are several other things that I wish to speak about Radhakrishnan, probably during the discussions, with this small, very brief prelude. And I'm extremely happy that we have a scholar from Canada who has had sufficient exposure to what is happening in and around in contemporary philosophy, coming over to speak to this Indian community of philosophers. It is here we have a gathering of Sanskrit scholars and philosophers brought to one single platform, and we are eagerly waiting to listen to Professor Sweet as how he understands Dr. Radhakrishnan as he presented Indian philosophy to the Western community. Over to Professor Sweet. Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Srikala, for that very kind introduction. And I also want to thank Preeti for that beautiful invocation at the beginning. I think that was marvelous. I think before I start, I should maybe say why I became interested in this. in this topic. Over the last number of years, I think partly as a result of my travels to India, I've become interested in what one might call intercultural philosophy. And I think it's a concept that's very difficult to define. But I think the interesting thing about it is it asks people from different cultural traditions, which have their own traditions of philosophy and so on, to see how and whether they can effectively collaborate, whether they can communicate, whether they can learn from each other, and so on. And so I decided what I would do is try to find for my students an example of someone who seemed to be able to make that kind of bridge. And one of the people that I knew something about was Radhakrishnan. And as many of you know, Radhakrishnan was someone who was educated in English medium schools, elementary school, secondary school, and college. So in a way, he had that experience, almost sort of an immersion experience in the European traditions. But at the same time, of course, he has his own native tradition. He's the son of a poor Brahmin. He is, living in a relatively impoverished community and that sort of thing. And yet he wants to sort of bring together what he's sort of learning in school and what he has as his lived experience as an Indian. And I thought that there's someone who, in a way, bridges traditions, that in some sense he is able to make sense of one tradition in terms of another. And that if one is going to engage in intercultural philosophy, sometimes we need bridges. Because in order to do intercultural philosophy, you have to know about more than one culture, I think. In order to do intercultural philosophy, you have to be immersed in it, or at least you have to have mentors who've had that immersion, who can sort of communicate a bit of that to you. And so I use the example of Radhakrishnan for my students, one of whom has an Indian origin, but most of whom have very little experience with India or even with other cultures. And I thought that if we could look at someone like Radhakrishnan, we might be able to develop a model of intercultural philosophy, or at least see how one would go about developing a model of intercultural philosophy. So that just says a little bit about the background as to how I came to this. So why choose this topic? I think I will say a little bit about that as time goes on. So it's Radhakrishnan and the origins of intercultural philosophy. But intercultural philosophy is something that is becoming more popular. I would say in the last 10 years or so, one finds more and more writing by scholars outside of Asia and India and Africa who are looking to engage philosophers in those areas. I think it's becoming more popular, and I think that Radhakrishnan has a role in the origin and development of intercultural philosophy. But I think his early work especially also provides a model of what such an approach to philosophy as intercultural philosophy will look like. So I think that we want to see that. Now, as Professor Srikala has mentioned, Radhakrishnan is someone, certainly he has no need for an introduction. He's someone who's known to all of you. He fits largely within the Vedanta tradition of Shankara. And so I thought that it is appropriate for the International School of Sri Sankaracharya Studies that Radhakrishnan would be a person that one would look at. And yet, I would say these days, although he is well known, he's not widely read. Philosophy written in the colonial period has been relatively little studied compared to the classics. And there's even some disdain about colonial philosophy. So maybe it's a bit hard for me to hear. I think there's some background noise. In any event, let me just say that I think that there has been some disregard of Radhakrishnan, as Professor Srikala mentioned. And even the late Dayakrishna, a philosopher who I met shortly before his death, he said at one point, "I will say that philosophy written in English is not Indian philosophy, that Indian philosophy is not written in English but in Sanskrit. And I think if you have that very strong a view, then you could see why someone would be somewhat dismissive of Radhakrishnan's views.
Oh, sorry, ഞാനൊരു മീറ്റിംഗിലാണ്. What is it?
I think that even in a number of recent collections of Indian philosophy in English, and there are a number of volumes that have been published, it's interesting that you will find a reference to the works of K.C. Bhattacharya, to R.V. Das, to a number of other major figures, but oddly enough, Radhakrishnan doesn't figure in this. And one reason may be, as Professor Srikala mentioned, is that people don't often see him as a scholar of Indian philosophy. They see him as a kind of maybe popularizer or a kind of a person who talks a bit about philosophy, but they don't see him as a technical scholar of that. And part of that may be because Radhakrishnan spent a good half of his professional career outside of the academy. For about the first 20 years of his academic, of his life, he spent time in the academy, teaching at a number of universities, but very soon he was moved into university administration, and then from there into the diplomatic corps, and then, of course, as you know, into roles of government as vice president and as president of India. So I think there are reasons why some people don't read him, but nevertheless, I want to argue that Radhakrishnan should be read. I think that he was a major figure in giving an explanation and a defense of Indian philosophy. And I think that his work was relatively well received among international scholars of philosophy. That for the longest time, in order to have some knowledge of Indian philosophy, it was through the medium of Radhakrishnan and Radhakrishnan's works. I think that his writings provide an example and a model for what came to be called comparative philosophy, and something that I think has evolved today towards what we might call intercultural philosophy. And I think also that the focus, especially of his early work in ethics, provides a concrete basis and concrete examples for bringing different traditions into contact. I think that if one is going to look at doing intercultural philosophy, it's always useful to find something that is a kind of a shared experience. And we all share the experience of trying to figure out ethical issues, what we should do in life, whether we should pursue our own interests, whether we should pursue the interests of others, and so on. And I think that ethics provides a kind of a concrete meeting place or basis to give different examples that will show a kind of communication between, let's call it Western and non-Western thought. And so I think that that Dayakrishna's claim that philosophy written in English is not Indian philosophy is maybe a bit of hyperbole. I think it's a bit of exaggeration, if not just question begging. Well, if I think that Radhakrishnan is important in this way, I should say something about what intercultural philosophy is. And so I want to take probably about half of my talk to talk a bit about intercultural philosophy, what it means, what its roots are, and I think then we can move to talk a little bit more detail about Radhakrishnan. Now, the term intercultural philosophy is a fairly new one. I think it dates from basically about 1990, and you find it referred to first of all in Germany. And as you know, there are a lot of German scholars who've had a long connection with the study of Indian philosophy. So you find this idea of intercultural philosophy starting in about 1990. But what it does, I think, is it attempts to capture and develop an earlier insight about how to do philosophy in a pluralistic world. In other words, that earlier insight was what was called, and in some places still is called, comparative philosophy. Now, if you ask about comparative philosophy, that too is relatively new. It's something that is maybe a little over about 100 years old. It's associated with the work of figures in Europe, such as the French philosopher Paul Masson-Oursel. He lived from 1882 to 1956. So for Masson-Oursel, comparative philosophy is, and this is a quote from one of his works, the general examination of the ways in which human beings of all races and cultures reflect upon their actions and act upon their reflections. So it's an examination of ways in which we reflect on our actions and act on our reflections. But this term is also associated with the work of the Indian philosopher Brajendranath Seal, and in turn with figures such as Radhakrishnan and P.T. Raju. P.T. Raju was a Indian philosopher of the 20th century, initially was in the north of India, and then spent a lot of his career in America. Now, in all of these authors and all of these philosophers, there's an emphasis on recognizing the importance of culture in and to philosophy. And this is a recognition that's not always been the case. I think if you look at a lot of philosophy, that very often philosophy has been done without really examining what the cultural assumptions or cultural presuppositions are. And so whether difference of culture in terms of time, in terms of place, and so on, the idea is that, well, culture is not all that important. And I think that what these authors like Seal and Raju and so on remind us of is the importance of culture in philosophy, in articulating the questions of philosophy, in developing the language of philosophy, in even talking about what counts as a good philosophical answer and what doesn't. And this is, as I say, something that's not always been the case. I think another thing about this idea of comparative philosophy is that it is an effort to give voice to or to recover marginalized philosophies. That if you think about philosophy as it's done in universities, even what you might call Western philosophy, Western philosophy as discussed in universities is a very, very small part of the West. Very often you will do philosophies of Germany, of France, of England, of Holland. You won't talk about the philosophies of Portugal or of Spain or of Yugoslavia or Croatia and so on. So, I mean, even this idea of what is the center and what are on the margins is I think, a troubling one. And this is something I think that people like Seal and Raju and Radhakrishnan tried to address. They tried to give voice to philosophers who are outside, outside of the main, are on the margins. Now, I think that there's a significant difference, though, between the approach of Masson or Roussel and the approach of people like Seal. I think that for Masson or Roussel, he saw philosophers as individuals who were looking at different philosophical traditions sort of for their own sake. And he thought that philosophers should look at a wide range of phenomena, but he didn't think that there were any specific set of answers to philosophical questions. For Masson or Roussel, doing comparative philosophy was really not a matter of content or substance or answers or solutions, but rather of method. So he writes that the real problem of comparative philosophy consists not in the determination of its concept, but in the pursuit of a rigorous method. And what is this rigorous method? He thought that comparative philosophy should follow a kind of scientific method in the positivist tradition of the French philosopher Auguste Comte, that we simply had to sort of look at just the facts, and the facts by themselves say it all, that it doesn't have to engage other cultures, it doesn't have to respond to other cultures, it simply has to describe other cultures. Now, for someone like Brajendranath Seal and others, comparative philosophy is something more than this descriptive activity. So in Seal's case, it is a historical comparison of traditions. And so like Masson or Roussel, it is historical in a comparison. But its aim is that this is to illustrate or to lead to mutual engagement. And so Seal seems to, although have written very little about what counts as comparative philosophy itself, nevertheless, in a volume entitled Comparative Studies in Vaishnavism and Christianity from 1899, he says something of what comparative philosophy on his view would involve. And he writes that historical comparison, such as has been here proposed, implies that the objects compared are of coordinate rank and belong more or less to the same stage in the development of human culture. In other words, the presumption is that there's an equality of traditions being compared. It's not like there is the important cultures and then other cultures sort of supply something on the side, that there's an equality of the cultures that are being discussed. Moreover, Seal also seems to hold that such comparisons and engagements are possible because there has been a general history of human culture and progress the unfolding of a single ideal plan or pattern, a universal movement, and that the same general historic plan in obedience to the same general laws of progress. In other words, there's a kind of universality about philosophy. So Seale also argues that historical comparative studies will lead to the discovery of general laws of the social organism. So for example, while the aim of these comparative studies is to show relationships and mutual exchange, in the book I just mentioned, between Christianity and Vaishnavism, more importantly, they are to lay the foundation for a true philosophy of universal history and not give us mere European side views of humanity for the world's panorama. So for Seale, there's an outcome expected from this comparative method. It's not simply comparison for its own sake, or for the study of each on its own terms, which sort of seems to be the one of Masson or Roussel. There's a suggestion of a kind of commensurability, a kind of commonality of cultures. But Seale doesn't give us the details of such a method, nor does he say specifically what the result of such a historical investigation and analysis would be. So I think that the idea of comparative philosophy can be understood in at least two distinct senses. And therefore, I think there's a need for a conceptual clarification and for the concept of intercultural philosophy. And so you can see intercultural philosophy is trying to describe the kind of comparative philosophy in the tradition of Seale rather than in the tradition of Masson or Roussel. Now, I'm not going to say much about what exactly intercultural philosophy is until we've looked at a bit of it. And for that, I want to look at Radhakrishnan and some of his texts. But before I do that, I just want to anticipate a possible objection and say briefly a reply to it. Now, some people might say that terms like intercultural philosophy and comparative philosophy are unnecessary or redundant. There's just philosophy. And I will admit I'm mildly sympathetic to this view. That is, there's philosophy. And the idea of calling it intercultural or comparative might suggest it's not really real philosophy. What I want to say is that intercultural philosophy, though, doesn't claim that it does a different kind of philosophy or that there's a different content that's distinctive, but rather that it reflects a different kind of approach. So just as we can talk about having a historical approach to philosophy or a phenomenological approach to philosophy or an analytic approach to philosophy, so we can talk about an intercultural approach to philosophy. We can say that it's an approach that recognizes the cultural origins of philosophies and philosophical traditions, and of the differences and therefore identities of traditions, because traditions are different, obviously. It's one that insists on an equality of traditions, that talks about a value in preserving these traditions. But of course, tradition is something that is not just static. Tradition is something that is alive, it moves. And so I think that an intercultural philosophy is something that is also progressive. So without defining exactly what intercultural philosophy is, I think it's clear that it's appropriate to look at philosophy through the lens of culture. And hence, the early work about comparative philosophy was to look at philosophy through the lens of culture. And I think that there are different ways of looking at philosophy through the lens of culture. And intercultural philosophy is one way of doing this. So that's a very long kind of introduction to this idea of intercultural philosophy, a bit of what its historical roots are, and a bit of what I think animates the idea of intercultural philosophy. But that's all at a very abstract level. What I want to do now is I want to try to just pick a couple of examples from Radhakrishnan, and especially Radhakrishnan's early writings, and use these as a kind of basis for making some more general statements about intercultural philosophy. So what I want to do now is say just a little bit about Radhakrishnan and some of his very early writings, in fact, his earliest writings. This is from a period of roughly 1908 to 1916. And in that early period, Radhakrishnan published about a dozen articles, and 7 or 8 of these focused on ethics. Now, I think that you can't understand the point of these early articles by Radhakrishnan unless you understand them in the context of his master's thesis, a master's thesis called The Ethics of the Vedanta and Its Metaphysical Presuppositions. So as I said a bit earlier, if we're talking about Radhakrishnan, he might not be a technical scholar in the way in which some other Indian philosophers were technical scholars, but he certainly saw himself as working in the Vedanta tradition and in the Vedanta tradition of Shankara. So I think this is something that's suitable to all of our interests in this group. And I think that when we look at these articles, these early articles, in the context of this early written work by Radhakrishnan, when we see this context, we see that Radhakrishnan is making a number of points that not only explain a view of what Indian philosophy is, but it's also an attempt to engage, to open a dialogue with, to discuss with Western traditions. Now, admittedly, this work, The Ethics of the Vedanta, was not Radhakrishnan's best work. Radhakrishnan himself says in an autobiographical statement, he says that, "When I look back upon this juvenile and rhetorical production, I am ashamed I ever wrote it." And, maybe that's something that we all might say about our early work. Sometimes we look back and we say, well, I'm a bit ashamed of that early work. But I think that's maybe to be overly modest. As I've just said, I think that early thesis, The Ethics of the Vedanta and Its Metaphysical Presuppositions, was the source of a number of publications over the next 8 years, but it also gives us a context for what lies behind those articles. In other words, why would he write on these topics? What was the motivation? It was also the beginning of his work as someone giving an explanation and a defense of Indian philosophy. That for the longest time, Indian philosophy was sort of seen as exotic, as a little bit sort of, unusual. And if you're familiar with the work of the time, you would find people like Max Muller in Britain, who would publish these texts of Indian philosophy, of Buddhist philosophy, of Hindu philosophy, and so on. But they didn't really engage the philosophical discussion, so they were seen as a little bit exotic and so on. And I think that Radhakrishnan, by writing this thesis, which he published, it's about 100 pages long, is in a way beginning to give a bit of an explanation and a defense of Indian philosophy. But I also think it becomes a model about how to do philosophy, about how to do something like comparative, or what we might call today intercultural philosophy. So let me just give you a very brief description of what that early work was. And then I'll say a little bit about a couple of the ideas that come up in looking at that work. So if we look at that Ethics of the Vedanta and its metaphysical presuppositions, I think it sort of falls into roughly four sections. There's a relatively long introduction. It takes up about a quarter of the thesis, and it provides a general account of Indian, and specifically Hindu philosophy, in which Radhakrishnan makes a case for there being a genuine philosophy in India, but also expressing his preference specifically for the Vedanta philosophy of Shankara. And then he gives a brief statement of about 20 pages about Vedanta metaphysics. And by Vedanta metaphysics here, he means a kind of idealist theory of the absolute. So Professor Nair talked about the idealism that I'm interested in, the British idealism and so on. But of course, there are other idealistic traditions, and we have the idealistic traditions of India. So he spends about 20 pages talking about Vedanta metaphysics, but also of Indian epistemology. And then we have a third section, and this is where he gets to, in a way, the topic of his thesis, the ethics of the Vedanta. And so he talks about what is called the summum bonum, or the goal of Vedanta ethics. And when he's talking about this idea of the goal of Vedanta ethics, he certainly, describes something about it, but he spends a lot of time talking about the idea of personality. And this may seem rather odd, like why on earth is he talking about the idea of personality when he's talking about the summum bonum? And I think here it's because what he wants to do is he wants to try to make Indian philosophy clearer and more intelligible to people who aren't familiar with the tradition. And one of the key issues is about the nature of the self. And I'll come back to this idea of talking about the summum bonum in a moment. But I think that what we find here in this third section is a description of the summum bonum, a discussion of personality, and then an explanation about how one can attain the summum bonum. In other words, what are the kinds of yoga that one engages in order to acquire this good? And then at the very end of this thesis, there's a short conclusion in which he responds to some criticisms or some advanced criticisms of Indian ethics. Now, what we don't see in any of this, we don't see it in his early writings, including in this Ethics of the Vedanta, is any statement of what exactly motivated his work. So why is he writing this? And so, although Radhakrishnan does address some criticisms of Indian philosophy in his brief conclusion to the Ethics of the Vedanta, he doesn't really say, well, this is what's motivating it. And so you might want to ask yourself, well, why on earth would Radhakrishnan write about karma and free will? Why would he write about Kant and the Ethics of the Bhagavad Gita? Why would he write about egoism and altruism? Why would he write about these things? And I think the standard account of the genesis of Radhakrishnan's thesis and of all of this early work up to about 1920 was that it was an attempt to deal with a number of criticisms that had been raised against Indian philosophy by its critics. Now, it's commonly held that Radhakrishnan's MA thesis was somehow supposed to be a response to one of Radhakrishnan's teachers at Madras Christian College, where Radhakrishnan was a student from 1904 to 1909. And one of his teachers, perhaps the best known, is someone named Alfred George Hogg. Alfred George Hogg had written a text on karma and redemption, and somehow criticizing the Indian tradition because he said it didn't really provide a kind of solid ethics in the way in which ethics should be done. And in a way, you might say Radhakrishnan's thesis might have been a kind of response to Hogg's criticism, although he doesn't mention Hogg at all in the thesis. But it is certainly true that before Radhakrishnan and after Radhakrishnan's early work, Hinduism, and especially Hindu ethics, was criticized by many of the British Christian philosophers and teachers at the Christian-affiliated colleges and universities in India. He had his own teachers in Madras, at Madras Christian College, in Bombay at Wilson College. John Mackenzie was a very famous author who wrote a big book on Hindu ethics that came out in the early 1920s. W.S. Urquhart of the Scottish Churches College in Calcutta also criticized Hinduism. He argued, for example, that Hindu philosophy is irretrievably mixed up with Hindu religion, and so it's not even clear that there is a Hindu philosophy, that there's not a real philosophy there, and so it doesn't have to be taken seriously as a philosophy. And that even if there were a Hindu philosophy, Hindu ethics wasn't a genuine ethics because it lacked a number of characteristics that one normally expects ethics to supply. And so Radhakrishnan is writing in this background, not just from his own teachers, but in general, that there's a lot of criticism of Hinduism, that there's not a clear Hindu philosophy, and that even if you could talk about Hindu philosophy, it doesn't have a clear ethics. And so therefore, it's nothing that has to be taken very seriously. And so what Radhakrishnan is going to do is he's going to say that, well, there are a number of problems with this kind of understanding, that the alleged deficiencies in the eyes of its critics of Hindu ethics and so on is something that has to be responded to. And so therefore, the study of Hinduism is not supposed to be just a matter of historical interest. It's a matter of genuine philosophical interest. So he sort of wants to recover the Indian traditions as a way of engaging it as serious philosophy. And so what one finds in Radhakrishnan's early writings then is a response to each of these criticisms about whether there is an Indian philosophy, whether it's related to religion, whether there is an ethics, what kind of ethics it does. I think you find this early on. And what Radhakrishnan argues is that there are not only is a philosophy in the Indian tradition, but there are philosophies in the Indian traditions. But these philosophies, although related to, are also distinct from traditional religion, and that the Vedantin tradition of Shankara is a preferable approach to doing philosophy, and that there is an Indian ethics, at least on a par with so at least similar to, if not even in some respects better than, the major philosophies of Greek antiquity, like Plato and Aristotle, but also the major philosophies of modern Europe. And so he would argue that Indian philosophy has a rational rather than a simply religious character, and that this ethics can not only engage, but can maybe even provide responses to some of the debates going on in contemporary Western ethics. So in other words, he's going to try to make an argument in this early work to say that Indian philosophy really exists, that Indian ethics really exists, and that this is something that we have to take seriously on its own grounds as an equal participant in philosophical study. Now, I can't deal with all of his discussion and all of his responses in the Ethics of the Vedanta and this early work. But I think by looking at a couple of elements, we can see a bit of a pattern, and therefore what his approach to philosophy was. And so I'm just going to give a couple of examples given the time that's passing here. First, I think if we look at the introduction to the Ethics of the Vedanta, now that beginning to his thesis was reprinted with very minor changes as his second published article. And in this, he gives a general outline of the history of Indian philosophy, a bit of an idea about things started and how philosophical traditions developed. Now, why is this important to a thesis on the ethics of the Vedanta? Though he doesn't say so explicitly, what this does is make a case for the existence of a genuine Indian philosophy against the views of people like Mackenzie, who said there's no real Indian philosophy, but a mix of religion and philosophy. But what this also does is makes a methodological and interpretive point. What it does is it attempts to show the other, or one's interlocutors, where one is coming from. It's an attempt to show the people that he is speaking to where he's coming from, but also to show that he's aware of his own presuppositions. So as a good philosopher, you should be aware of what your own presuppositions are. And I think this text at the beginning of the Ethics of the Vedanta is a statement of, yes, I know where I'm coming from. I know what my assumptions are, and I know about the tradition that I'm coming from. And so what this does is this articulates the philosophy that underlies Radhakrishnan's approach to ethics, how it was not obviously a religious approach to ethics, but a more rational one. And of course, in doing this, Radhakrishnan makes many controversial claims, and that's a matter of debate. I think a lot of people would say they don't agree with Radhakrishnan's interpretation of the tradition, but nevertheless, Radhakrishnan cannot be accused of being unaware that there are important presuppositions that both he and his interlocutors, his teachers and other scholars, are making. Now note that he doesn't say this explicitly. He doesn't say, I'm going to give you my presuppositions right now, or here are the assumptions that I'm making. He doesn't say this. But what he does want to do is he wants to show us that this is how good philosophizing is done. So the first part of that thesis gives us a bit of a history that says that there is something that is genuinely philosophical in the Indian tradition, and it's not to be confused with some early religious texts. Now, another presupposition of ethics is that ethics presupposes the existence of free will, and that it involves doing something more than simply engaging in certain kinds of behavior. That ethics involves a subject taking a principled stance and being able to justify these principles. And so in that introduction, and then in some other work as well, he deals with the issue of karma and free will. And so his first published article, it's interesting, his first published article is a short article on karma and free will. And it's something that he comes back to a little bit later in an essay called The Ethics of the Bhagavad Gita and Kant, which was perhaps his first famous article. And that is that there's this problem in ethics, if you're looking at ethics, about the nature of free will, and how would that fit with a tradition in which you have the notion of karma. And I think that this debate is important because one of the criticisms by Hogg and others raised the question whether a tradition of karma was consistent with the true ethics. And the criticism was that a kind of karma view of the universe was too judicial, that it sort of saw things as being, if you do this, then there's a punishment. And if you do something else, then there's a kind of reward. So it's a kind of judicial judgment, which excludes the idea of mercy, which excludes the idea of forgiveness, which are other sort of ethical traits. Another criticism of this kind of karma view is that it seemed to put aside the notion of free will in the moral agent, that the role of the agent was simply to do his or her duty, not to reflect on his or her duty, not to ask whether he should do his or her duty, and then also the claim that one's situation in society, because of karmic law, led to a kind of ethical passivity. That is, I'm in this situation because of something that happened before I was born, and so therefore my job is just to go along with it. It's a kind of passivity. It's not to actively challenge it or to engage it. And so I think that there's a problem that Radhakrishnan had to address. That if this interpretation by his critics of karma theory was that it was judicial, it excluded mercy, it had little role for free will, it made a kind of ethical passivity in individuals. If these criticisms held, well, then what kind of ethics would you have to offer? And so he had to deal with that. And so he deals with that in that text. And he also deals with it, as I said, in some later work. And so I think his recognition of this as a problem and his willingness to engage that shows a kind of philosophical approach to it that is going to be something that allows a bridging of cultures. That someone in a tradition that's unfamiliar with the karmic traditions would say, well, now I get a better insight into what's going on here. Now, let me give you, I think, maybe just one or two other examples. He moves from this introduction to a discussion of Vedanta metaphysics, and then that becomes the foundation for a discussion of Vedantan ethics. And he says that for anything to be an ethics, it has to have a summum bonum, it has to have a goal. So, for example, if you think of traditions like the tradition of Aristotle, the ethical goal is flourishing, eudaimonia, it's happiness. Or if you look at the tradition of Kant, the tradition of Kant says the summum bonum is, in a way, the formation of a goodwill. The only thing that is good in itself is a goodwill. Or for Mill, we have the summum bonum as the greatest happiness of the greatest number. So the question would be, is there a summum bonum in Vedantan ethics? And Radhakrishnan's answer is, well, yes, there is. So just as there are summum bonums in other systems of ethics, so there is in Vedantan ethics. And the goal in Vedantan ethics is to realize the oneness of self with Brahman. So there's the goal, to achieve or to realize the unity of self with Brahman. And the term that he sometimes uses in this text is also the absolute, which is a term which would be very familiar to his audience, because in the idealist traditions in Western Europe, for example, there was a lot of discussion of the notion of the absolute. It was a term that had a relationship to Hegel, but it also developed especially in England with people like Bradley and Bosanquet. And so if this is the goal of ethics, is to realize the oneness of self with Brahman, there are some problems that might arise, and that is, well, what is this Brahman? What is this absolute? Is it a self? Is it a person? And that's one of the reasons why he wants to talk about personality, to try to explain what it means to talk about Brahman or the absolute. And then the second thing is that if the goal is to realize the oneness of self with Brahman, does this mean that effectively one loses oneself in the absolute? That, in other words, is a dissolution entirely of personality. And if there's a dissolution of personality in the absolute, well, why should I engage in this? Why should I be interested in that? Because presumably people have an interest in themselves. So, there's the kind of problem that Radhakrishnan wants to deal with, and he realizes there are problems about it, and he has to respond. Now, he doesn't come back to this issue of the summum bonum in others of his early writings, but he does say that the Vedantan response to this idea of summum bonum is something that will be helpful in solving a lot of other questions that are of concern to Western philosophers. So, for example, one of the questions would be, why pursue the summum bonum? And the standard question in ethics is basically, why be ethical? And so this is a question: should we be motivated by self-interest, or should we be motivated by something that's altruistic, that is putting the interests of others ahead of ourselves? Or is there some other kind of reason? And I think what Radhakrishnan does is, Radhakrishnan says, is that there's already a problem built into those responses. The response seems to be, it's either going to be an egoistic response or an altruistic response. And he thinks that both of these fail because it imports a dualism that he thinks is inappropriate. And so the better way of trying to solve these problems is to try to attack the dualisms. In other words, a lot of the ethical problems that arise, he would say, in the Western traditions, are problems that are focused around dualisms. And the response to them is not so much to engage in the arguments about them, but to say, you're making an assumption. And the assumption is that dualism is fundamental. And he says, my response to this from the Vedantin tradition is that that assumption of dualism is mistaken. That there's a unity of self and the absolute, that is one that doesn't dissolve the self, but it understands the self in a different way. So what is interesting, I think, is that in this discussion, Radhakrishnan's suggestion is that although the problem has been dealt with a lot in the European traditions, in the Vedantin tradition, it has not only been dealt with in a way, Vedanta has a solution to it. So I think if you take a look at these two examples, what we find, and we find these in other examples, is that we have a model about how to do philosophy, not across cultures, like two silos and they're sort of dealing with it across, but among cultures. And that therefore serves or supports what he would call a comparative philosophy later in life, and what I think that we can call an intercultural philosophy. So now that I've said a little bit about Radhakrishnan, let me try to pull out some characteristics of what was going on in this discussion. I think what we see is, we see in the first place a recognition that philosophy is embedded in culture, that there are going to be differences of terminology, differences of language, differences of way in which one casts the problem. So culture provides the concerns, the questions, the issues, and even the concepts and language of philosophical ideas. But there's also a recognition that where you start is, you don't start by trying to find common ground. You start from where you are. And common ground, might come about in a kind of engage or in a dialogue. And to what point do you share something with the other? To what point is there a difference? You're not going to know where those differences and shared points are unless you start the discussion. So we start from where we are. We don't deny our own tradition. But we recognize that there's a need to articulate one's own presuppositions. So what is it that I'm assuming when I'm doing this? What is it that I'm bringing to the table? What am I assuming about the self? What am I assuming about the nature of dialogue? What am I assuming about the nature of rationality, let's say? There also has to be an attempt to understand where the others are coming from. So what are the assumptions of my interlocutors? Where are they coming from? And I think that Radhakrishnan was well placed to know where his interlocutors were coming from, because he was brought up in these English medium schools, in these Christian schools. And so he knew about the kinds of questions, the kinds of assumptions that his interlocutors had. But it's not enough just to articulate one's own presuppositions or to invite one's own interlocutors to the table. You have to show a respect for the interlocutor. So it's not just a matter of understanding your presuppositions, understanding their presuppositions. It's also a matter of approaching the discussion at a certain level of welcoming, at a certain level of humility. So in other words, there's a bit of a dialogical character to this. And as far as possible, what one wants to do is try to find benchmark terms that might help to explain or help to clarify one's concepts in the other's language. And so this is why I think Radhakrishnan moves back and forth between talking about Brahman and the absolute. Brahman would be a term maybe not very well known, but the absolute, people would say, well, I know something about that. And so in other words, finding certain terminology allows for the possibility of the beginning of the discussion. Now, it's not that that's the end of the discussion, but at least we know how to get into that. And once we have these familiar benchmark terms, like the absolute, let's say, or duty or obligation, then we can seek other areas of overlap or common ground. This is not to underestimate difference or to underemphasize disagreement. Because for people just to want to say, well, we're going to ignore the differences or avoid the disagreements, that's not doing philosophy. But rather that the purpose of this discussion is in part, not so much to arrive at a solution to the problem, although I think Radhakrishnan thought he had a solution to these problems, but at least to make clearer where you had common ground and where you didn't. And if you are clear where you don't have common ground, again, that becomes the place for pursuing a discussion. So what is the aim, I think, of Radhakrishnan's approach in these early writings? Well, in part, I think one of the aims was to add to our knowledge. That is, he's trying to tell the non-Indian, the interlocutor, the foreigner, the Christian missionary, whatever, something more about the Indian tradition. But he's also trying to get people to see that the Indian traditions can extend something in Western traditions, that where Western traditions seem to run into stalemates or problems, like the problem between egoism and altruism, that the Vedantin tradition offers a way to respond to that dead end. I think that one of Radhakrishnan's aim was to get us to rethink our own presuppositions. So to ask ourselves as philosophers, what exactly are we bringing to the table? And then maybe over the course of that discussion, we can change, we can replace. So as I said, I think that tradition is not something that is a dead end, it's something that is living. And so tradition responds to this engagement with novelty, with this engagement with the other. Now, I'm not claiming that Radhakrishnan had all this in mind when he wrote these early writings. I'm sure he didn't have all this in mind. But I think that they're present in these early writings. And I think by looking at these early writings, we see an effort to do philosophy among cultures, not just, here's my philosophy, there's your philosophy, but let's do philosophy together. And we see a kind of model about how to do this. So this is not just a comparative activity. This is how it's done in Hinduism, this is how it's done in Christianity, this is how it's done in some other philosophy. And it doesn't look to providing general laws or to provide a foundation for universal history, the kind of thing that I think Seal was doing. But I think it does suggest an approach, taking other philosophers equally, seriously, and with openness. And I think this is what we mean today in doing intercultural philosophy. And I will stop there. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, dear Professor, for your delightful talk. Now the floor is open to all for the discussion, and I will invite Mr. Shiklan now to moderate it.
Thank you, Shimi. Thank you, Professor Sweet, for that wonderful lecture. He began raising the issue as to how to do philosophy in a pluralistic world and has highlighted the problem of some of the streams, or rather several philosophies get marginalized from the mainstream discussions to which Indian philosophy also fallen, and talked about the possibility of philosophy being looked at through the lens of culture. And then once he entered into Indian philosophy through the gate of Dr. Radhakrishnan, he spoke eloquently on the various issues that Radhakrishnan has picked up. For instance, how Indian philosophy is irrevertibly mixed with religion, and the problem of Indian ethics, the challenges that have been raised by the Western scholars saying that there is nothing called Indian ethics, and Radhakrishnan's own contributions to synthesize the free will and the theory of karmas. And he concluded citing some of the difficulties that may emerge while doing intercultural philosophies and Radhakrishnan's own model of how to resolve these troubles. Thank you so much, Professor Sweet, for that wonderful lecture. And now the floor is open for discussion.
Thank you, Madam.
Yes.
Let me first Myself, Avinash Kumar Srivastav.
ठीक बोलिए.
Let me first congratulate William Sweet. I have heard him thrice. It is the third time I am listening to him, and his exposition is very crystal and clear. One thing I would like to say that it is Radhakrishnan and Vivekananda who brought the entire Indian philosophy to the Western world, and secondly, he has tried to amalgamate the Western philosophy with the Indian as well, because I have gone through one edited book of Radhakrishnan with some, just I'm forgetting the name, Eastern Religion and Western Thought. So, yeah, so you will find he has tried to rationalize the Indian spirit and Indian culture in a philosophical way. So, because earlier the people were of the impression, particularly the Western world, that Indian philosophy is nothing but the Indian religion only. It is a simple culture only, and it is he and he only. He has a spotlight. It is not only a culture. It is not only a religion, but it is it is out and out philosophy as well. So he has tried to philosophize. He has tried to see the things in the Western models also sometimes, and that's why he has tried to compare Eastern and Western thoughts at the same time. Secondly, Professor Sweet has rightly observed that he is out and out Vedantin, because Vedanta was he has imbibed Vedanta, and he was living Vedanta also, and that's why he has tried to see all the philosophy through the framework of the Vedanta and try to rationalize also. When I was going through Indian philosophy volume 1, and he was just giving a remark on Buddhism. One thing he has said: Buddha born, brought up, and died as a Hindu, though the Hindu turn was not at the time of the Buddha. So it is his thing, because his Vedantin feelings were so loaded in his mind that he has tried to see the entire philosophy in a Vedantic lens. And this is the only thing that I want to say. Thank you very much, Professor Sweet, for your nice deliberation and exposition as well. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much for those comments.
My name is Sandosh. Can I ask one question?
Wait a minute, please. Professor
Thank you very much for those questions. I think that there may be two questions that we should always bring to this too, and that is, was Radhakrishnan right? Well, maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. That's a matter of philosophical discussion. But then the other question is, well, then how do we find out whether he's right, or how do we make sense of that? And I think that for me, that's the more important question. So whether he was right about Buddhism, whether he was right about his approach, we could, as scholars, we could have a discussion about this. But at least he's trying to give us a kind of model of how to engage in that discussion. And I think that's what I wanted to draw to our attention, is I think that he gives us a model that is something that I think that more and more philosophers are only now starting to think of. More than 100 years after this early writing. That finally I think there are more and more global philosophers who are engaging traditions outside of their own tradition in a real way. And so Radhakrishnan gives us a bit of a model about how we might approach that. And I think that's a good contribution. But thank you very much for your comments.
Thank you.
Professor Sweet, can you pick up those questions in the chat box? Are there some questions in the chat box, I feel?
Oh, let's see here. Okay.
Madam, my keyboard is not functioning, and that's why I cannot put these questions on the chat.
That's okay. So, are there questions in the chat box?
Okay, yes, there's, let's see now, there's here from Dr. RLB. Okay, perhaps we are Mayas, and Maya is the bridge between the world and Brahman. The world and Brahman are not directly connected with each other, so Maya is important in Dr. Radhakrishnan's doctrine of Maya, and Maya is real. Right. So I think that's something that does come up, I think, a little bit later in Radhakrishnan's philosophy, not in the earliest part, but a little bit here, and it's developed later. And that is to ask really what Maya is. And again, there's a matter of debate about whether he's got it right or not. I think that what Radhakrishnan is concerned about is that if we think of the world as Maya, then why should we be ethically engaged? Why should we do anything? If this is something that's not really the real, what difference does it make? Why should I be thinking about this? And so I think that, in that later work, he wants to say that, well, Maya, it's not that it's not real. It's not that it's just that it's not the right perspective, ultimately the right perspective. And so that we should take Maya seriously, because if we are in this sort of situation, then our ethical actions do make a difference. So that's why I think you're right. Maya is important in his doctrine, because if he can't explain what Maya is, then the criticism that Indian ethics is a kind of passive ethics might be a strong criticism. So he does have to respond to that. I think that's true. Could Dr. Radhakrishnan be considered a Neo-Vedantin? Some people, yes, do call him a Neo-Vedantin. I don't know specifically what you have to believe to be a Neo-Vedantin, but I know that some people have described him that way. And he's got this great respect for the Vedantin tradition, as I said. And he's not a scholar of it in the way in which I think some of the people here today perhaps are scholars of the tradition. But he certainly thinks it's got the right approach. I think that's certainly true. So those are the questions from the chat box.
All right.
So far, anyway.
Thank you. Santosh, please.
Can you tell what is the difference between intercultural philosophy and multiculturalism?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And what I would say is that, and this is not a canonical view. This is not like an established view, but I would take a multiculturalism or a multicultural philosophy would be just each tradition has its own language, has its own rules, has its own reasoning and that sort of thing, and there's no requirement that these different cultures actually engage one another. So if you think about a multicultural society, it's probably the case there'll be some engagement, but whether they're about matters of value, whether they're about matters of ethics, whether they're about matters of religion, whether they're about metaphysical issues, no. I mean, by and large, Canada is a multicultural society, and there's extremely little interaction at that level. It's true people from different cultures will work in the same workplace. They will have a variety of occupations and so on. But, those questions of fundamental value, those questions of religion, those questions of metaphysics, those are not being engaged. Whereas I think the thing about an intercultural approach to things is that it says that there has to be a kind of engagement, that there has to be a kind of response, and that it's risky because you don't want to assimilate traditions. So you sort of make them into one big tradition. You want to respect differences, but at the same time, you want to say that, well, there has to be a kind of a common language when we talk about values. So if we talk about, let's say, human rights, that, there's a lot of discussion about this, but at least we share a commitment to certain things, or at least we want to engage in the discussion about what these rights are. And so I think a kind of intercultural approach to philosophy is that there has to be that engagement, which there may not have to be in multiculturalism. So interculturalism would have diversity of culture and tradition, but one that also seeks to engage in a kind of interaction. Whereas I think a multicultural approach doesn't have to do that. It sort of creates silos and so on. And I think that's more of a problem. So that's how I would see multiculturalism and interculturalism related to philosophy. This is my own sort of reflection, because in Canada there are both multiculturalists and interculturalists. But India is another multicultural society, and I suppose you would have the same challenges there too.
That's
But
right.
thank you for that.
Yeah. Are there any further questions? If not, then I'll have a quick exchange of idea with Professor Sweet. Are there any more questions forthcoming?
Ma'am, there is one question in the chat box.
There seems to be one question in the chat box, Professor Sweet.
I've answered, I think, the two that I saw. If there is another one, could you kindly type it in the chat box again?
Shimi,
I've missed it.
he has already addressed the two questions. If there is the third one, then please could you type it to the chat box?
Yes, ma'am. It was asked by Lakshmi S. Menon. Could Dr. Radhakrishnan be considered a non-Vedanti?
Neo Vedantin.
Neo-Vedanta.
He has already addressed that.
Yeah.
Professor Sweet, so since there is no one else coming forth with a question, then I will have a chance probably. So you have beautifully said, as a true researcher in the area of culture, you have beautifully spread out the issues that may impinge on someone who is attempting to place his food outside the culture. As someone who has been doing it for quite some time, as you also know, that I have this pinch particularly. In my question, to be specific, of course, we can have an extended dialogue a little later. Is it necessary that, see, there is one group who argue that you cannot place philosophy in the mid-air, like philosophy should necessarily be seen from the cultural lens. To give an example, take epistemology, for instance, and we all talk about, the standard analysis, the Gettier problem, so on and so forth. But then now Indian philosophers and several other philosophers from different cultures do argue, this is just an instance, arguing that the Gettier problem that has been cited has not been addressed particularly, for instance, from Indian epistemology. And similarly is the case with some of certain issues in philosophy of language, particularly the language that comes from a particular culture doesn't address the issues that are raised within the Anglo-Saxon philosophy where it looms large. So the question is, should we necessarily place philosophy within or should we necessarily see philosophy through the lens of culture? Over to you.
Well, that's a good question. It's a big question. I'll put it this way. To go back then, I think that in some situations, if we don't have the language in our own language to articulate a problem, then it will be very difficult to solve it. Or if the language is very awkward. So, suppose in many of the, let's say in some religious traditions like Christianity, people talk about body and soul. So there's a kind of a dualism there. Now, one of the big debates in let's say European philosophy has been, well, what's the relation of the body and the soul? Okay. But suppose you come from a tradition where you don't see the world that way. I mean, that's just simply not what reality is. You might say there's only one thing, or you might say there's a multiplicity. And so you might say, well, I could translate that question into my language. So I could sort of understand it at the level of a translation, but it doesn't really mean anything to me. Or I could engage that question, but it's like almost like a kind of game that, if I make these assumptions, then what would the relation of body and soul be? But it doesn't actually mean anything to me because I don't think that's the nature of what human beings are. And so you could say that in some cases, even if we could find the language to translate one problem into another language, you may say, well, that just doesn't strike us as being a way of doing that. Now, I mean, I wouldn't say that that therefore that's the end of philosophical discussion. Maybe there would be analogous problems and so on, but not every problem in philosophy has to be translated into every other language. But I do think the interesting thing about ethics is that there are some issues that we're all faced with. How should I treat the people around me? How should I treat myself? How should I live my life, and so on? And obviously the answers are going to be influenced by the cultures we happen to live in, but at least the questions are similar questions. And so again, you could have a discussion about those questions. Whether the answers would be satisfying, again, that could be different. And I think that what intercultural philosophy does is it would say, well, maybe there are questions that would be useful. So, I talk to you about how I should live my life. You tell me more about Shankara. I learn a bit about that. And I don't have to read everything Shankara has written, but you've told me something, and I can say, well, maybe I can make an interpretation of that will respond to the issue that I have. So again, there's a kind of philosophizing going on. We're not reaching the answer about it, but we're engaging in a pursuit of knowledge, a pursuit of truth. And if what I can draw from another tradition is, or even triggers something in me that will help me solve this, well, then I think there's philosophizing going on. So I don't think that, if the language doesn't address the issue, or again, if the problem itself doesn't make sense in my language, I don't think, well, then it's not a problem. It's a problem for somebody else. Not all philosophical problems have to be philosophical problems for everybody. But some do, I think. Some do. I think ethical problems do. Some metaphysical problems do. But some particular ones, like the Gettier problem, is that a problem for people in China? Maybe not. So,
That's it. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful answer. Are there any further questions?
Oh, I see there's one in the chat box. Can I explain the influence of Hegelian idealism and Radhakrishnan? Well, again, it's a bit of a long story, but I think the short version is this. So a kind of Hegelianism was very popular when Radhakrishnan was a young man. So when he was going to secondary school, when he was going to college, there was a kind of Scottish and English idealism. And one of the versions of this would be close to Hegel and call it absolute idealism. And that's Bradley and Bosanquet. And there they said that at the end of the day, personhood is not ultimately real. So you can see how that would fit in a way with talk about Brahman as the kind of unity of all selves, or a kind of overcoming of the self. But there was another branch of that idealism called personalistic idealism, and these were the ones that influenced Radhakrishnan's teachers. So his teachers were personal idealists, and they were because they were mostly Christian, and so they had to believe there were persons, like that they were persons, or that God is a person or something. And so if persons are real, then what do we make of these other of these other phenomena? So I'd say that what's the influence of Hegelian idealism? I think it's indirect. I think that there's the absolute idealism that he would have studied in school, a bit of Bradley, that sort of thing, and maybe McTaggart. But there's also this personal idealism to people like Pringle Pattison in Scotland. And Pringle Pattison was a teacher of some of Radhakrishnan's teachers. So there's a kind of influence that way. But remember, an influence doesn't mean you agree with it. I had teachers who were metaphysical naturalists when I was an undergraduate, and I reject metaphysical naturalism. So, that's, the influence is there, but the influence is that was wrong. And I think, again, Radhakrishnan was in that situation. There was an influence of that personal idealism, and he thought, no, that's wrong. And he's more inclined towards the more absolute idealism. That maybe that answers that question. Then there's another question here from Dr. RLB. My worry is that whether we are social animals or whether we're world animals by Radhakrishnan. Second, does he consider society and the world as identical? I guess it depends what you mean by social. I think we are social animals in the sense that we live in society, we have language, we have culture, we have traditions, and so on. This is certainly important for the development of our own understanding, or that sort of thing. But is there such a thing as a world animal? I guess common to all cultures and societies? I don't think that there's one kind of social animal, if that's what is meant by world animal. I don't think there's one kind of, but I mean, obviously we're human beings and we are social beings and we can interact with other social beings, but they don't have to be of the same society or the same culture. And so does he consider society and the world as identical? I wouldn't think so, no. I don't recall whether he ever raised that question, but I don't think he would, no. I hope that's a bit of an answer to that question.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful interactive session. Now over to Shimi.
Thank you, dear all. And with lots of love, I invite Professor K.M. Sankaneshan, Assistant Director, ISSS, to propose the vote of thanks.
Pronounced to all, respected scholars and dear friends. I am very happy being a part of the International School for Sri Shankara Studies. In the leadership of Professor Srikala, this school could arrange a wonderful intellectual feast in this festival occasion. Of course, today we were listening to an informative and thought-provoking lecture. On behalf of the International School for Sri Shankara Studies and on behalf of the listeners of this program, I express heartfelt gratitude to Professor William Sweet, who made this evening a worthy one with his enlightening lecture on Radhakrishnan and the origins of intercultural philosophy. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for your questions.
All eminent scholars who made this program more meaningful by their deliberations. I wholeheartedly thank Professor Srikala M. Nair, the director of the International School for Shankaracharya Studies, for her introductory remarks and for her leadership. Thank you, teacher. I express our gratitude to all participants of this program. Once again, thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you all
Thank you, everyone.
for the next talk. Thank you, Professor Sweet, on my behalf as well. We look forward to have you in person very short to International School of Sri Shankara Studies as well as to the Department of Philosophy.
We are also thankful to you for inviting us to such a nice lecture. And I'm thankful to William Sweet for explaining Radhakrishnan in a very nice way. And thank you once again.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Sweet, once again on behalf of all.
Thank you very much, everyone. Have a happy new year.
Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year to you all.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much for participating in this program.
Thank
Namaste,
you.
madam.
Namaste.
Thank you, madam.
Namaste. Goodbye.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much for everyone, and a very happy new year.
Wish you the all, madam.